She didn't know she had a mate. He did. He had known for 6 years, and for 6 years, he made a choice, the hardest choice a man can make, to step back, to stay silent, to watch her build a life in a city that had nothing to do with him, while he quietly kept her safe from a distance she never knew existed. He paid a debt she didn't know she had. He warned off a man she thought left on his own. He wrote letters to her mother every month, careful, steady letters, asking only one question in 100 different ways. Is she happy? He never asked for anything in return. He told himself that was enough. And then she came back to Ashveil, and 6 years of discipline crumbled in the time it took their eyes to meet across a fog-covered town square. Now another man has come to claim what he believes is already his. The clock is running, the town is watching, and the one woman Stellan Caden has spent 6 years protecting from a distance is standing in front of him, asking a question he has never let himself answer. This is the story of what happens when a man who gave up everything finally decides he's done letting go. This is The Fog Between Us, Chapter 1. The drive into Ashveil took 40 minutes longer than it should have. Wren told herself it was the mountain roads, the way they curved without warning, the way the fog settled into the valley like something living, patient and low and thick against the tires of her car. She told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that she had not been back in 8 years, that she had not planned to come back at all, that the only reason she was here now was a phone call from a lawyer with a soft voice and careful language who had used the word estate 3 times before Wren understood. He meant her mother was gone. She gripped the steering wheel. The fog did not care. Ashveil appeared the way it always had, gradually, reluctantly, like a town that preferred to be discovered rather than found. First the water tower, then the steeple of the old church on Birch Hill, then the rooftops, amber and gray against the November sky, and finally the town square itself, cobblestone and old wood, and hanging lanterns that someone had already lit despite the fact that it was barely 10 in the morning. Wren pulled to a stop at the edge of the square and sat for a moment with the engine running. It looked different. That was the first thing she noticed. Not worse, not abandoned, but genuinely different. Tended. The storefronts had fresh paint. The old fountain in the center of the square had been restored, its stone base clean and its water running clear despite the cold. Window boxes held late-season herbs, still green. Someone had replaced the cracked pavement along the east side of the square with smooth, even stone that matched the original perfectly. Someone had been taking care of this place. She turned the engine off. She had 7 days. She had promised herself 7 days to settle the estate, arrange the property sale, collect what little of her mother's things she wanted to keep, and get back to her apartment in Portland where her life was waiting, uncomplicated, organized, hers. 7 days in Ashveil. She had survived worse. Her mother's house was 3 blocks from the square, on a street that still smelled like pine resin and wood smoke no matter the season. The key the lawyer had mailed her stuck slightly in the lock, the same way it always had, and then the door swung open into a cold, quiet hallway that smelled like her mother's hand lotion and old books, and something else underneath, something Wren couldn't name, that made her eyes sting before she had time to prepare for it. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she carried her bags inside and told herself she was fine. She was not fine. She spent the first hour opening windows despite the cold, moving through the small rooms with deliberate efficiency, making a mental inventory of what needed to go, what needed sorting, what could wait. Her mother had been neat, always neat, and the house reflected that. Nothing was in chaos. Everything was simply still, which was, somehow, worse than chaos would have been. It was on her 3rd pass through the living room that she heard voices in the square and drifted, without deciding to the front window. The fog had thinned slightly. Through what remained of it, she could see the square, the fountain, the benches, the morning's first few residents beginning their days, and 3 men standing near the entrance to the timber cooperative office on the far side, 2 older men in heavy coats, and 1 younger man with his back to her, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed in a canvas work jacket that did nothing to soften the impression of someone who was simply, fundamentally built differently from the people around him. He was speaking. She couldn't hear the words. The two older men were listening with the focused attention of people who take what they're being told seriously. Wren watched, and she couldn't have said why. And then, as though she had said his name aloud, as though the fog had carried some signal she hadn't intended to send, the man turned. Across the square, through the thinning morning haze, his eyes found her window with a directness that made no sense at that distance. In that light, through glass she wasn't even sure was clean. Wren stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing something she didn't have language for. She stood against the living room wall, one hand pressed flat against the cold plaster, and breathed carefully through her nose. That was nothing, she told herself. He probably didn't even see you. That was a coincidence. That was the fog playing tricks. That was grief making everything feel significant. She moved back to her inventory list. She did not return to the window. But for the rest of that afternoon, no matter what room she was in, no matter what she was sorting or cataloging or carefully not feeling, she was aware, with a precision she couldn't explain, of being watched. And the strangest part, the part she would not admit to herself until much later, was that it didn't frighten her at all. Chapter 2. The estate was a mess. Not visibly, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone walking through the house, but legally, structurally, in the way that matters when a person dies and leaves behind a life they apparently lived on several levels simultaneously. Wren sat across from Ashveil's only estate lawyer, a tired-looking man named Gerald Park, who wore reading glasses on a chain and used a yellow legal pad like it was the most advanced technology available to him, and tried to absorb the information being delivered to her in calm, measured installments. There were accounts she didn't recognize, a secondary property deed with clauses that Gerald described as unusual but not unprecedented, 3 outstanding agreements with local organizations, the Timber Cooperative, the Community Land Trust, the Historical Preservation Society, all of which her mother had apparently been party to in ways that would require untangling before the main property could be listed for sale. How long? Wren asked. Gerald looked at his pad. To untangle everything cleanly, 3 weeks. Possibly 4. 3 weeks. She had given herself 7 days. Her editor in Portland was expecting a manuscript revision. Her apartment was paid through the month. Her carefully constructed, deliberately uncomplicated life was waiting for her to return to it. Is there a faster way? She asked. Gerald considered this. You'd need someone who knows the local systems, the cooperative agreements in particular. They're informal in the way that mountain town agreements often are, which means they require local knowledge more than legal expertise. He paused. Stellan Caden would be your best resource there. He manages the cooperative, sits on the land trust board. He knew your mother well. Stellan Caden. Wren filed the name away without reaction. She found him the next morning in the general store on the east side of the square, reaching for something on a high shelf with the calm efficiency of someone who has never once needed to ask for help. She rounded the corner of the cereal aisle and walked directly into the box of dried oats he had just taken down. The box hit the floor. Oats went everywhere. I'm sorry, they both said simultaneously, and then stopped. He was taller up close than the square had suggested. Dark eyes, the kind of dark that wasn't quite brown and wasn't quite black, but lived somewhere between the two. A jaw that was doing considerably more work than strictly necessary. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than surprise. Something that looked, unsettlingly, like recognition. Wren Litmus, he said, not a question. You know who I am? Small town. A pause. And your mother talked about you. Something about the way he said it, quietly, with a weight that didn't match the casualness of the words, made her look at him a half-second longer than she intended. They cleaned up the oats together. He introduced himself without ceremony. Stellan Caden. Timber cooperative. Town council. Sorry about the oats. It was entirely his fault. The shelf placement in this store had been a problem for years. She told him about the estate complications. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he said Gerald Park was right and offered his help with the cooperative agreements without making it feel like charity. She almost said no. The reflex was immediate. She had been saying no to help for so long that it functioned like a first language. She said yes. She wasn't sure why. They spoke for 10 minutes in the cereal aisle, and then another 20 outside on the square steps, because neither of them moved toward leaving, and neither of them acknowledged that. He was measured in a way she found simultaneously frustrating and compelling. Every word deliberate, nothing wasted, nothing performed. He didn't try to charm her. He didn't fill silence with noise. He simply talked to her like she was someone worth being precise with. She walked home carrying her groceries and a faint, unresolved feeling she couldn't name. That evening her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Dax Mercer, incoming call. She didn't recognize the name. She let it ring. When it went to voicemail, no message was left. She stood in her mother's kitchen in the quiet and stared at the name on her screen long after the notification cleared. The fog pressed against the window glass. Somewhere up the mountain, something moved through the trees, a sound too distant to identify, too deliberate to be the wind. She stared at Dax Mercer's name and felt with no logical basis whatsoever that her 7 days had just gotten significantly more complicated. Chapter 3. Ashveil had a particular relationship with Stellan Caden that Wren noticed the way you notice something that's been in front of you for days before it finally resolves into meaning. It wasn't deference exactly, or rather it was deference, but not the performed, slightly fearful kind that came from authority being wielded. It was something quieter, more instinctive. The way people shifted slightly when he entered a room, not away from him, but toward him, like compass needles making a small, unconscious correction. The way conversations paused, just briefly, when he spoke, even when he wasn't saying anything particularly commanding. The way the town seemed to exhale when he was present and hold its breath, slightly, when he wasn't. Wren noticed all of it. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, carefully, with the particular attention of someone who had spent years writing about human behavior and knew that the details people don't think to perform are always the most truthful ones. She noticed it, and she didn't mention it to him. On their third meeting, his kitchen table this time, estate documents spread between them. Late afternoon light going amber through the window, she tested a question on Mrs. Hale's information. The elderly neighbor had let something slip over the fence that morning, in the comfortable, slightly too casual way that people share information they know will land heavily. Your mother and Stellan were close, you know. He was very good to her, more than just neighborly. How long did you know my mother? Wren asked, not looking up from the document in front of her. A beat. Short, but present tenses, Stellan said. She never mentioned you. No, he said. She wouldn't have. Wren looked up. He was reading a land trust clause with the focused neutrality of someone giving a document their complete attention. His coffee cup was at his right hand. Without looking, without measuring, he picked it up and set it back down in exactly the same position. She had been watching for it. The coffee. She hadn't told him how she took hers when he'd made it on their second meeting. He'd handed her a cup and she'd drunk it without looking, and it had been exactly right. Black, no sugar, slightly cooler than most people would consider acceptable because she'd spent too many years drinking it distracted and cold, and had developed a preference for the temperature out of habit. He hadn't asked. He had simply known. She'd told herself it was a guess, that black coffee with no sugar was common enough, that she was assigning significance to a coincidence because grief did strange things to pattern recognition. She watched him now and let herself wonder for the first time whether it was a coincidence at all. What was she like? Wren asked. To you, what was she like? He set the document down. He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and for a moment she felt the full weight of everything he wasn't saying pressing against the space between them like something physical. Honest, he said finally, quietly determined. She loved you in a way that organized everything else around it. A pause. She talked about you every time I saw her. Ren looked back at her document because her throat had done something she didn't want him to see. They worked for another 2 hours. She told him things she hadn't planned to. About leaving Ashveil at 18. About the way the town had felt too small and too known and too full of a history she wanted to outrun. About Portland, which was large and indifferent, and exactly what she had needed for a long time. About the manuscript sitting unfinished on her laptop, the novel about a woman who builds walls so carefully, she forgets there's something worth protecting inside them. She stopped herself when she realized what she'd said. He didn't comment, he simply listened, with the kind of attention that made things feel safe to say. She walked home in the early dark, fog rising from the ground in slow drifts, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She was thinking about the coffee, about she wouldn't have mentioned me, about the way he had said she loved you in a way that organized everything else around it. Past tense, factual, like a man reporting something he had witnessed directly. She was halfway to her mother's house when it struck her. She had never told him how she took her coffee. She stopped on the pavement. She had never told him. The fog moved around her ankles. Up the mountain, something called. Low, distant, more vibration than sound. She walked the rest of the way home considerably faster than she'd left. Chapter 4. Dax Mercer called again on a Wednesday morning, and this time Ren answered. His voice was the first thing. Warm, easy, calibrated to a frequency of reasonableness that she recognized immediately as something practiced. The voice of someone who had learned, early and well, that charm was the most efficient tool available. Ren, I'm so glad you picked up. I've been trying to reach you. I wanted to offer my condolences about your mother. She was a remarkable woman. I don't know you, Ren said. A small pause. No, I imagine she didn't explain things before she passed. I'm sorry about that. It puts you in an uncomfortable position, and that was never the intention. His tone shifted slightly, still warm, but with an undercurrent of something that might have been impatience wearing patience as a costume. My name is Dax Mercer. My family and yours have a long-standing agreement. I think once as I explain the details, you'll find it's actually a very reasonable arrangement. What kind of arrangement? A formal one, between our families. Another pause, this one more deliberate. Between us, specifically. Ren felt something go very still inside her. I think you need to be considerably clearer than that. He was very clear. He spoke for 7 minutes. About pack agreements, about family alliances, about a formal arrangement her mother had signed when Ren was 19, about how these things were traditional, practical, mutually beneficial, about how he'd looked forward to meeting her properly, about how he was certain, once they had a chance to speak in person, that she'd understand this was simply the way things worked in their world. Ren hung up. She called Gerald Park before she'd reached the end of the street. Gerald was careful with his words, in the way that people are careful when they know the thing they're saying will explode on impact. The arrangement was real. Her mother had signed it. It was binding under pack law in the absence of a formal objection from an alpha of Ren's bloodline. And Ren, raised on the edges of pack society, had no alpha to object on her behalf. Is this legal? Ren asked. Under pack law, yes. Under civil law, Gerald paused. It's complicated. She went to Stellan. Not for comfort. She told herself that very clearly on the 4-block walk to his office at the cooperative. For information, he knew pack law. He knew this world better than she did. She needed information, not comfort. And the distinction was important because comfort implied she needed something from him. And she had learned a very long time ago that needing things from people was how you ended up losing them. His office was at the back of the cooperative building, small, practical, full of maps and timber surveys, and a single window that looked out onto the mountain. He was on the phone when she arrived. He took one look at her face and ended the call. She told him everything in 2 minutes flat. He listened without moving, without interrupting. His expression stayed carefully, deliberately neutral, which was, she was beginning to understand, the expression he wore when he was feeling something he had decided not to feel in front of her. He explained pack law in the same measured way he approached everything: the arrangement, the objection clause, the 48-hour window once a formal claim was invoked. He explained it all with the methodical precision of someone who has known this information for a very long time and has spent a very long time deciding what to do about it. She watched his hands during the explanation. They were flat on the desk, perfectly still. The stillness of someone holding something back with a force that left no room for anything else. "Is there anyone who could object?" she asked. "An alpha of my bloodline, do I have one? Is there anyone who could formally stand against this?" Stellan looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her, with a directness that felt like the first completely unguarded thing she'd seen from him since she arrived in Ashveil. His dark eyes held something vast and carefully contained, something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this question. The silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. "Yes," he said quietly, "there is." The words settled between them like something irrevocable. Ren stared at him. "Who?" But he had already looked away, back to the desk, back to the careful neutrality of a man who had said slightly more than he intended, and was in the process of deciding what to do about that. She left his office with the answer to one question, and approximately 20 new ones. The fog outside was thicker than it had been that morning. She stood on the cooperative steps and breathed the cold mountain air and felt the shape of something she couldn't yet name pressing against the inside of her chest like a word she hadn't learned yet, but already somehow knew. Chapter 5. The storm came in fast, the way mountain storms always do. One moment the sky was simply gray, and the next it was making decisions. Ren was in the middle of her mother's bedroom. Halfway through a box of winter clothes she'd been cataloging for the donation pile when the lights went out. Not gradually, all at once. The house dropped into the particular dark of a mountain evening, without electricity, which is different from city dark in the way that silence is different from quiet. More complete, more total, with more weight to it. She had candles. She found them by memory and lit 3. She was pulling a blanket around her shoulders and resigning herself to an evening of reading by inadequate candlelight when she heard boots on the porch steps. She opened the door before he knocked. Stellan stood in the rain with an armful of firewood, the kind of prepared practicality that required either foreknowledge or the habit of showing up where he was needed without needing to be asked. His jacket was dark with rain across the shoulders. He was not, she noticed, wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say. "Power's out across the whole south quarter," he said. "Your fireplace hasn't been lit since," a brief pause. "In a while, the wood might be damp. I brought dry." She stepped back. He came in. He built the fire with the efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times, which he probably had. She made tea on the gas stove and handed him a cup without asking how he took it. She had been paying attention these past days, the same way he had apparently been paying attention to her, and he accepted it with a look that acknowledged the gesture without making it into something she'd feel the need to retreat from. They sat. The fire built itself into something real and warm. The storm pressed against the windows with steady persistence. Outside, the mountain was doing what mountains do in reminding everything smaller than itself of the appropriate scale of things. She was warm for the first time since she'd arrived in Ashveil. It was the warmth, probably, that loosened something, that made her reach for the distraction of her mother's things, still spread across the coffee table, the sorted piles, the items she'd been cataloging. Her hand found the journal without her quite deciding to reach for it. A small dark green thing, cloth covered, her mother's handwriting on the first page in the particular slant that Ren would have recognized anywhere. She opened it. She read the first entry silently, then the second, and then, without looking up, without making a decision about it, she began to read aloud, her mother's voice through the journal, the particular way she observed things, quietly, warmly, with the patient affection of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting rather than merely tolerable. She wrote about the town, about the cooperative's new programs, about a fox she'd seen 3 mornings running in the back garden, about Wren, always about Wren, the updates delivered with the particular mix of maternal pride and careful restraint of a woman who understood her daughter needed space and gave it without making the giving feel like a loss. And then, 3 months in, 7 months in, a year in, the entries that mentioned SS stopped by with the preserves from the Harmon farm. He knows I love the blackberry. He never makes a fuss of it, just leaves them on the step. I think that's his way. S told me today that the situation in Portland has been handled. He wouldn't say more. He never does. But I slept better last night than I have in months. S asked how she was. I told him she was writing, which she always is when she's happy. He smiled. He has a very careful smile, like he's only allowing part of it. Wren stopped reading. The fire crackled. Rain moved against the glass in long, uneven sheets. She was aware, with a precision that had nothing to do with temperature, of exactly how close Stellan was sitting, the 3 feet of sofa between them that had been ordinary distance an hour ago, and was now something else entirely. She looked up from the journal. He was looking at the fire. His profile in the firelight was still and serious and quietly devastated in a way she didn't think he knew she could see. His jaw was tight. His tea was untouched. His hands, resting on his thighs, were very, very still. She looked at the journal. She looked at him. She didn't ask. The question sat in her throat, fully formed, and she held it there, because some part of her understood that the answer was going to change the architecture of something, and she was not yet ready for what that would cost her. She kept reading safer passages. Her mother's observations of the changing season, the preparations for winter, the small, gentle details of a life lived quietly and with tremendous purpose. At some point, the storm's rhythm became something like music. At some point, the warmth of the fire and the weight of the week and the sound of her own voice reading her mother's words did what grief and exhaustion will eventually do to even the most determined. Resistant, she woke to stillness. The storm had passed. The candles had burned low. The fire was not the small, dying thing she'd expected to find. It was steady, recently fed, its embers glowing with the particular quality of wood that has been tended within the last hour. The sofa beside her was empty. The front door was closed. The latch caught quietly. She sat up and looked at the fireplace for a long moment. He had left. He had fed the fire before he left. He had made sure she was warm before he walked out into a post-storm mountain night, rather than wake her to say goodbye. Wren pressed both hands to her face and breathed. Outside, the fog had returned, lower than before, slower, moving through the yard in long drifts like something looking for a place to settle. She sat in the warmth he'd left behind and felt the shape of something she was not ready to name pull tighter around her chest, insistent and inevitable as the tide. Chapter 6. Morning came gray and clear-aired, the way mornings do after mountain storms. Everything washed clean and sharply itself. The fog not gone but retreated, temporary, waiting. Stellan was different. She noticed it within the first 2 minutes of seeing him. At the cooperative, where she'd gone to return a folder of documents she'd finished reviewing, he was behind the front desk speaking with one of his staff, and when he saw her he smiled. A precise, professional, carefully bounded smile. The smile of someone who has made a decision overnight and is implementing it with full commitment. Wren, her name, delivered with the exact same measured warmth he'd have used for anyone. "Did you manage all right with the power outage?" "Fine," she said. "Equally measured, equally precise. Thank you for the firewood." "Of course." Brief, final. The conversational equivalent of a door closing politely. She handed over the folder. He thanked her. She left. She walked back to her mother's house, with her spine very straight, and her jaw set in the particular way she'd perfected at 19, when she'd learned that the most effective response to a door closing was to stop wanting it open. She called the property appraiser and scheduled a walkthrough. She opened her laptop and wrote 400 words of her manuscript. Not good words, but present ones. She called her editor in Portland and confirmed she'd be back within 2 weeks. She made a grocery list, reorganized her mother's linen closet, and spent 40 minutes deciding which pieces of her mother's jewelry to keep and which to pass on. And she did all of it with the focused efficiency of someone who has given herself absolutely no room to feel things she hasn't scheduled. By noon, she had almost convinced herself that last night had been nothing. A storm, a fireplace, the natural intimacy of a small house, and inadequate lighting. Nothing that required rearranging anything. At 12:30, she went to the only restaurant in Ashveil for lunch, because her mother's refrigerator was uninspiring, and she opened the door and nearly walked into a man she'd never seen before, who was rising from a table with the smooth, self-possessed ease of someone who considers themselves the most important person in any room they enter. He was handsome, deliberately so, the kind of handsome that requires maintenance and knows it. Dark blonde hair, good jaw, the kind of easy confidence that reads as charm until you look at the eyes which were assessing her with a speed and directness that had nothing to do with attraction, everything to do with evaluation. "Ren Litmus," he said, and smiled like he'd been expecting her. "I was hoping I'd run into you. I'm Dax Mercer." She knew the name. The knowing of it settled in her stomach like something cold. He was gracious, attentive. He insisted on buying her lunch. Not asking, insisting, with the practiced smoothness of someone who has never had the word no delivered in a tone he had to take seriously. He spoke about the arrangement with an ease that was more unsettling than hostility would have been. Like it was already decided. Like she was already his, and they were simply working through the administrative formalities. "I think you'll find Mercer territory suits you," he said over his coffee, with a smile that didn't quite reach the assessment behind his eyes. "It's different from Ashveil, obviously. More infrastructure. More." A small pause that managed to communicate his precise opinion of Ashveil's infrastructure, resources. "I live in Portland," Ren said. "For now," Dax said pleasantly. She left 20 minutes later. She did not touch her food. She walked out into the cool November air and stood for a moment on the restaurant steps, breathing deliberately, organizing the sharp edges of her anger into something she could carry without cutting herself on it. Across the street, through the thinning midday fog, she saw Stellan. He was walking along the far pavement with the long, unhurried stride of someone covering distance, efficiently, a rolled blueprint under one arm. He would pass the restaurant without stopping. He was perhaps 40 feet away, and he looked up the way he always seemed to look up at precisely the right moment, and their eyes met across the street. She saw the moment he registered the restaurant behind her. The moment he understood who she'd been sitting with. Something moved across his face. Fast, controlled, immediately suppressed. His pace didn't change. His expression returned to neutral within a breath. He kept walking. But his hands, she saw, at his sides. His hands had curled into fists so tight, his knuckles had gone pale against the cold air. She watched him until he turned the corner, and the fog closed behind him like a curtain. She stood on the restaurant steps alone and felt the precise, particular frustration of watching someone feel something enormous and walk away from it like it weighed nothing. "Say something," she thought, at the empty corner where he'd been. "For once in your carefully managed life, Stellan Caden, say something." The fog drifted. The corner stayed empty. She walked home. Chapter 7. Gareth Moss had been a pack elder for 30 years, which meant he had the particular authority of someone who has outlasted everyone who ever disagreed with him. He was a compact, silver-haired man with a deliberate manner and eyes that calculated constantly behind an expression of patient reasonableness. He arrived at Stellan's office at 7 in the morning without an appointment, which communicated everything about how he viewed the balance of power between them. Stellan let him in, made no offer of coffee, stood rather than sitting, because some negotiations are shaped entirely by posture, and he had no intention of letting this one be shaped by Gareth's preference. "The Mercer arrangement," Gareth said, without preamble. "It's time to let it proceed." "The arrangement requires Wren Litmus's willing participation," Stellan said. "She has not indicated willingness. She's been here less than 2 weeks. She needs time to understand the situation." Gareth settled into the chair across from the desk, with the ease of someone making themselves comfortable in a space they consider theirs by right. Dax is reasonable. He's not asking for anything beyond what was agreed. What was agreed was never Wren's agreement to make. Her mother made it on her behalf. That's legally sufficient. Morally sufficient is a different question. Gareth's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. "I'm not here to debate philosophy, Stellan. I'm here to tell you that the Elder Council has reviewed the situation. Dax has their preliminary support. If you interfere with this arrangement, formally or informally, he has the right to challenge your alpha position. And he has grounds." A pause, deliberate and precise. "You've been protecting this woman from a distance for 6 years without pack sanction. We know about the interventions, the debt settlement, the warning you sent to that man in Portland. You've been acting as her alpha without declaring the bond. That's a violation of pack protocol, and every elder on that council knows it." The room was very quiet. "What you're telling me," Stellan said, "is that the choice is between my position and the arrangement proceeding. I'm telling you that if you step aside gracefully, everyone walks away intact. The Mercer alliance strengthens the pack. Dax gets what was promised. The Litmus estate is settled without complication." Gareth rose from the chair. "And you keep everything you've built here. The cooperative, the land trust, the protection this town depends on." He paused at the door. "Think carefully, Stellan. Some things are bigger than one bond." He left. Stellan stood in his office for a long time after the door closed. He thought about a 19-year-old girl driving out of Ashveil with everything she owned in a car that needed new tires, and the decision he had made, watching her go, that she deserved a life that didn't begin with a bond she hadn't chosen. He thought about 6 years of letters to her mother, 6 years of making sure from a distance that she was safe, 6 years of telling himself that was enough. That love, properly disciplined, could function as protection rather than possession. He thought about the fire he'd built last night, about her voice reading her mother's words in the warm light, about the way she'd looked asleep on that sofa. Not peaceful, exactly, but finally still, the particular stillness of someone who has stopped bracing for impact. He thought about Dax Mercer's hand on the back of her chair at the restaurant, the way Dax had looked at her, evaluating certain proprietary, he thought. "I am done making the noble choice." And then the door opened. He turned. Wren stood in the doorway, not all the way in, not committing to entering, holding a folder of documents she'd come to return. Her expression was in the process of shifting. Something had changed in it between the moment she reached for the door handle and the moment she saw his face. She had heard something, not all of it. He could tell from her eyes, which were processing rapidly, connecting points he hadn't meant to leave visible. But enough, her name, his voice saying it with an inflection he hadn't controlled as carefully as he should have. "Wren," he started. "Wrong time," she said quietly. Not angry, something more complicated than angry. "I'll come back." She left the folder on the corner of the front desk and walked back out into the fog. He let her go, because he didn't yet know what to say that would be honest without being too much. And he had learned, at considerable cost, that the wrong words at the wrong moment could destroy things that the right words given time might save. She walked home through the fog with her mother's journal waiting on the coffee table, and a bundle of letters tucked into the back of it that she had noticed but not yet opened, tied with kitchen twine, their pages slightly yellowed with time. She made tea. She sat down. She untied the twine. The handwriting on the first letter was not her mother's. It was clean, contained, slightly spare. The handwriting of someone who chooses their words carefully, even when writing by hand. She turned to the signature at the bottom. Stellan. She sat very still for a very long moment. Then she began to read. Chapter 8. There were 23 letters. She read them in order, the way you should read anything that is going to rearrange the furniture of everything you thought you understood. The first letter was dated 6 years ago, shortly after she'd left Ashveil for the second time. The visit for a cousin's wedding that had lasted 4 days and left her inexplicably more unsettled than when she'd arrived. She remembered that visit. She remembered driving back to Portland with the windows down despite the cold, playing music too loud, feeling like she was running from something she couldn't identify. She hadn't known then what she'd been running from. Dear Elena, the first letter began. I am writing because I don't know what else to do with this, and because you told me once that you'd want to know if things had gone too far. I believe they have. I believe she is my mate. I recognized it when I saw her at the wedding. Not gradually, not as a suspicion, but completely and immediately, the way you recognize your own name. I haven't said anything to her. I don't intend to. I am writing to you so that someone knows, and because I need to say it to someone who loves her as much as I have, apparently, without any warning, come to. Wren sat with that for a long time. She turned the page. The letters that followed were not love letters, or they were not only that, they were correspondence. Reports, almost, but warm at their edges. Stellan writing to her mother about the town, about the cooperative, about the seasons, and woven through all of it, with a care that was more revealing than any declaration could have been. Questions about Wren. How was she doing? Was the manuscript going well? Had she found somewhere that felt like home? She mentioned in that interview. He had read an interview she'd given 3 years ago about her first book. That she prefers cities because they ask nothing of you. I've been thinking about that. I think she's wrong, but I understand why she believes this. Cities ask nothing because they don't notice. I want her to be somewhere that notices her. But that's my preference, not her need, and I'm trying to learn the difference. A debt. In the 4th letter. There was a situation with a past due medical bill, significant, the kind that compounds badly. I've handled it. Don't tell her. She'll be angry. She should be angry if she finds out, and I'll accept that, but I couldn't leave it. A warning in the 8th letter. There was a man in her building. I received information about him through a contact in Portland who runs with the Caldwell pack. He was dangerous in a specific way, not dramatically, not visibly, but reliably. I sent word. He left the building within the week. She probably didn't notice he was gone. I prefer it that way. Her mother's responses, tucked between the letters, warm, brief, occasionally exasperated in the particular maternal way that communicates love through mild frustration. You cannot protect her from everything, Stellan. And later, she deserves to know. She deserves to choose. I know why you're doing this. I know you believe you're being good to her. But there is a version of this that stops being protection and starts being a decision made for her. And I need you to think carefully about which side of that line you're standing on. And his response in the 16th letter, which Wren read 3 times. You're right. I know you're right. I keep arriving at the same answer, that she has built something real, something hers, something that doesn't include this world or this town or what I am. And that telling her would ask her to rearrange everything around a bond she didn't choose. I don't want to be something that happens to her. I want to be something she chooses. So I'm waiting. I'm waiting until there's a real choice available to her, rather than just an obligation. The last letter was dated 4 months ago, before her mother got sick, before Wren knew anything was wrong. Elena, I think I've been waiting too long. I think I've mistaken patience for kindness and called my own cowardice by a better name. You've been right for years. I'm going to come to Portland. I'm going to tell her I just need. The letter ended there, mid-sentence, like it had been interrupted or abandoned, or like the man writing it had put down the pen to think and never picked it back up. Her mother had gotten sick 3 weeks after that letter's date. Stellan had not come to Portland, and her mother had died before any of them had the conversation they'd been circling for 6 years. Wren closed the letters. She sat in the quiet. The fog moved outside the window, slow and patient. She drove to his house. She didn't call first. She didn't plan what she was going to say. She knocked on the door of the old timber frame house on the edge of the cooperative property and stood in the cold with her heart doing something large and uncontrolled in her chest. And when he opened the door and saw her face, he went very still in the particular way she now recognized as Stellan Caden, feeling something he has not yet decided what to do with. "You wrote to my mother for 6 years, she said. He didn't deny it. He stepped back from the doorway. She came in. They sat at his kitchen table with the letters between them and the kind of quiet that exists not as an absence of noise, but as its own presence, heavy, necessary, full of everything that had been, waiting. He told her everything. The bond, the moment at the wedding, the decision, the deliberate, principled, devastating decision to step back rather than claim what the bond told him was his. The interventions, the letters, the 6 years of watching from a distance, because he had convinced himself that was the kindest version of love available to him. She listened. She let him finish. She waited until she was certain he was done. Then she told him what 6 years of not knowing had cost her. Not dramatically. She wasn't performing grief. She was reporting it, with the precision of someone who has learned to be honest about damages, because pretending it isn't there doesn't make it smaller. The years of feeling unmoored in Portland without understanding why. The relationships that never quite caught because something in her was always slightly turned in another direction. The way she had driven out of Ashveil after that wedding, with the windows down and music too loud, running from something she couldn't name because he had decided she didn't need to know its name yet. "You let me spend 6 years not knowing who I was supposed to come home to." Her voice broke on the last word. She hadn't planned for that. She pressed her lips together and breathed. Across the table, something broke in his expression too. Quietly, completely, like the last wall of something that had been holding for a very long time, finally giving up the effort. "Wren," he said, just her name. But the way he said it, with 6 years of everything compressed into 2 syllables, made it the longest sentence she had ever heard. She looked at him across the letters her mother had saved. The fog pressed against his kitchen window. The mountain breathed outside in the dark. Neither of them moved toward the other, but the distance between them felt, for the first time, like something that could be crossed. Chapter 9. Dax Mercer invoked the pack law at 9 o'clock the following morning. The formal notice arrived at Gerald Park's office. A single page, pack seal, precise legal language, and a timestamp that started the clock. 48 hours. Any alpha of Wren Litmus's bloodline had 48 hours to formally object to the Mercer arrangement, or the arrangement would be considered uncontested and legally binding. Gerald called Wren at 9:15. She was already awake. She had been awake since before dawn, sitting in her mother's kitchen with tea going cold beside her, thinking about letters and fires kept burning, and the particular expression on a man's face when he finally stops holding something back. She thanked Gerald and set her phone down and sat for 3 full minutes in the silence. Then she thought, "My mother left me a clause." It came to her the way the most important things come. Not as a revelation, but as a recognition, like finding something you've been looking for in a place you've walked past 100 times. Her mother had signed the arrangement. Her mother, who had spent 4 months gently pushing Stellan toward honesty, who had included kitchen twine with those letters so they'd be found together, who had been, as Stellan himself had said, quietly determined. Her mother who had loved her in a way that organized everything around it. She pulled up the scanned copy of the arrangement on Gerald's file portal. She read it with the focused attention she usually reserved for manuscript editing, looking for the seams, the choices, the places where language reveals intention. She found it in paragraph 7, subsection C, buried in the provisions her mother had insisted on during the original signing. Gerald had called it unusual language and left it at that. Wren read it 3 times. The arrangement shall be considered binding only upon the willing and uncoerced participation of Wren Litmus, to be confirmed by her own verbal declaration in the presence of the Elder Council. No declaration made under formal or informal duress, social pressure, or pack obligation shall satisfy this provision. Her mother had built her a door. Her mother had known 6 years ago that Wren might come back, that the arrangement might be invoked, that Wren would need a way out that didn't depend on anyone else's decision. So she had sat across from the Mercer family lawyers and a table full of pack elders, and quietly, without drama, inserted a requirement that every subsequent party had apparently overlooked or underestimated. Wren set her laptop down. She was crying, which she didn't immediately notice until she felt it on her face. She sat with it for a moment, let herself feel the full weight of her mother's love, the particular genius of a woman who protected her daughter not by fighting the world, but by quietly rewriting its rules. Thank you, she thought. You brilliant, impossible woman. Thank you. She wiped her face. She picked up her coat. She needed to find Stellan. She found him where she somehow already knew he would be, at the edge of the forest behind the cooperative, at the place where the tree line began and the mountain opened up ahead, standing in the fog with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face turned towards something she couldn't see, like a man who has been keeping a vigil, or a man who has been standing in one place long enough that the fog has learned to move around him. She stopped a few feet away. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the look on his face when he saw her was the least controlled thing she had ever seen from him. Relief and restraint in equal measure, wearing each other. I found the clause, she said. Something moved through him, not quite a breath, but close. I know, he said quietly. Your mother told me about it the day she signed. Wren stared at him. She told you. She called me that evening, she said. He stopped, looked at the fog for a moment, looked back at her. She said, I've made sure Wren always has a choice. Now your job is to make sure she knows the choice is real. The mountain was very quiet around them. And the 48 hours? Wren asked. I'm going to object, he said, simply. Finally, like a man setting down something he has carried too long. I should have done it 6 years ago. I should have told you 6 years ago, and let you decide then, and I didn't, because I was so certain that protecting you meant keeping myself out of your life, and I was wrong. Your mother knew I was wrong. She told me I was wrong. A pause. I'm done being wrong about this. Wren looked at him, at the fog moving around him, at the mountain behind him, at the face of a man who had spent 6 years making impossible choices, and was finally, completely, out of noble gestures. You're going to lose your alpha position if Dax challenges you, she said. Yes, he said, probably. And you're still going to object? Yes, she nodded slowly. The fog moved between them, slow, unhurried, like something that has been waiting a long time and has learned not to rush. Okay, she said. Okay, he repeated. Okay, she held his gaze. But Stellan, I need you to understand something. If I'm there when you make that declaration, if I stand next to you in front of those elders. She paused, and the next words came out careful and clear and entirely her own. It's not because of the bond. It's not because of pack law. It's not because my mother built me a door and you held it open, she breathed. It's because I'm choosing it. You. Because I want to. You need to know the difference. The expression that crossed across his face then was not something she had a word for yet. Something vast and quiet and very, very old. The expression of a man receiving something he had stopped believing was possible. I know the difference, he said. The fog settled around them both. The mountain exhaled. They had 36 hours. Chapter 10. The Elder Council convened at 7 o'clock the following evening in the meeting room above the cooperative. A long, low-ceilinged space with timber walls and a single stone hearth, and the particular weight of a room where important things have been decided for a long time. 7 elders. Gareth Moss at the center, Dax Mercer to the right, his lawyer beside him, his composure impeccable, and his certainty visible in the set of his shoulders, in the way he occupied his chair like it was already a throne. Stellan arrived without a lawyer. He arrived with Wren. She had not asked him if she should come. She had simply been standing at her mother's front door when he came to walk to the meeting, and she had her coat on, and he had looked at her for one long moment. Reading her, she was beginning to. And the way he always read her. And then he had nodded once, and they had walked the 4 blocks to the cooperative together in the fog without speaking, because some things don't require words when everything necessary has already been said. Gareth opened the proceedings with formal language that Wren mostly understood and partly didn't, and she filed the gaps away to ask about later, because there would be a later. She had decided that, with a certainty that surprised her with its completeness. Dax spoke first. He was good at it, clear, persuasive, framing the arrangement as to tradition and alliance and mutual benefit, never once saying claim or obligation or any of the words that would have revealed the thing for what it was. He was, she thought, the kind of person who had learned to make constraints sound like gifts. Then Stellan spoke. He didn't stand. He didn't perform. He spoke from where he was sitting, in the measured, deliberate voice she had come to associate with him, saying things he had thought about for a very long time. He acknowledged the arrangement. He acknowledged the pack law. He acknowledged, without hesitation, the 6 years of interventions that Gareth had documented. The debt, the warning in Portland, the letters. He didn't apologize for any of it. He explained it plainly. He had recognized his mate. He had made the choice to step back rather than bind her to something she hadn't chosen. And he had spent 6 years trying to honor both truths simultaneously. "I'm formally objecting to the Mercer arrangement," he said, as Wren Litmus's fated mate. Under pack law, that objection supersedes the family arrangement, unless Wren herself contests it. He paused. She doesn't contest it. 7 sets of eyes moved to Wren. She met them without flinching. "I don't contest it," she said clearly, her own voice, her own words, completely and entirely of her own volition. Dax's composure moved, not broke, but shifted, like ice demonstrating its temperature before the crack. "The bond claim requires proof," he said. "A fated mate claim can't simply be declared. It isn't simply declared." Stellan's voice was very quiet. "You felt it when she walked in, Dax. Everyone in this room felt it. You've known what she is to me since the moment you met her. That's why you moved the timeline up." The silence that followed had a specific quality, the silence of something true being said in a room that has been carefully avoiding it. Dax rose from his chair. What followed was not what the romance stories made it. It was not clean or choreographed or gloriously cinematic. It was 2 large men in a timber-framed room above a cooperative office in a small mountain town, and it was dangerous in the particular way of things that are real rather than performed. Dax was fast and certain and completely unafraid, which made him genuinely dangerous. Stellan was not faster. He was simply more committed to the outcome. It lasted 4 minutes. Wren watched from beside the hearth with her heart in her throat and her hands very still at her sides, and she did not look away, because he was doing this with full knowledge of what it might cost him, and she was not going to honor that with anything less than her complete attention. When it was done, Dax was helped to a chair, and Stellan was bleeding from a cut above his left eye, and Gareth was looking at both of them with the expression of a man recalculating a great many things simultaneously. "The bond claim stands," Gareth said finally, in the voice of someone making peace with a conclusion he hadn't chosen. "The Mercer arrangement is formally contested and suspended pending Wren Litmus's voluntary confirmation." He looked at Wren. "Miss Litmus, do you confirm?" She crossed the room. She stopped in front of Stellan, who was sitting with his elbows on the council table and blood on his face, looking at her with the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on another human being. She reached out and pressed her hand flat against his jaw, careful, deliberate, her choice. "I confirm," she said, not to Gareth. To Stellan, his hand came up and covered hers. Just that. Just his hand over hers, warm and certain, holding on. Dax left Ashveil before morning. The Elder Council filed their paperwork and dispersed into the night with the quiet efficiency of people who know when to stop arguing with reality. Gareth paused at the door and looked back at Stellan with an expression Ren couldn't fully read. Not quite an apology, but something adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged without saying that he had been on the wrong side of this. Then it was just the two of them in the empty meeting room, the fire burning low in the hearth, the fog moving past the high windows in long, slow drifts. She cleaned the cut above his eye with the first aid kit from the cooperative's back room, sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold air. He let her, which she understood was its own kind of language. This man who held everything so carefully, letting her be careful with him. "You're going to lose political ground with the elders," she said, concentrating on the cut. "Some of it," he agreed. Was it worth it? He waited until she looked up from what she was doing, until their eyes met at the particular distance of someone tending a wound, close enough to see everything. "Ask me in 50 years, he said. She laughed. It surprised both of them. The sound of it in the quiet room, genuine and unguarded. The laugh of someone who has put down a weight they've been carrying for so long they'd forgotten it wasn't part of them. He smiled. Not the careful, bounded, professionally warm smile she'd catalogued in their first weeks. The other one, the one she'd glimpsed through his mother's journal entries. The one that was only partially allowed, that let only some of itself through. She decided then that she was going to spend a considerable amount of time working on that. They walked back through Ashveil in the late-night fog. Not touching, not quite, the way you don't rush the last few steps of something you've been waiting for, because you want to be fully present when it arrives. The town was quiet. The fountain ran softly in the square. The hanging lanterns were lit, the way they always were, warm points of light in the fog. She stopped at the edge of the square. "I came back to say goodbye," she said. He stopped beside her. "I know. I had 7 days planned. I know." She looked at the town, her mother's town, his town, the town she had spent 8 years running from and had somehow, without deciding to, come home. To the fog moved through the square in slow, patient drifts. The mountain breathed above them both. "I'm going to need more than 7 days," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I have time." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the particular expression she had been collecting and cataloging and trying to name. Since the first morning she'd watched him through a fog-covered window and felt something pull in a direction she didn't have language for. She had the language for it now. She held out her hand. He took it, warm, certain, careful, and held on the way he did everything, with tremendous commitment and not a single wasted motion. They walked together through the fog toward the light of her mother's house, where a fire had been laid in the hearth for weeks, waiting for someone to finally come home and light it. She had come back to Ashveil to say goodbye. She stayed because, for the first time in 8 years, she finally felt like she was home. And that's where we leave Ren and Stellan. In the fog, in the quiet, finally on the same side of all the distance they put between themselves. If this story found something in you, if you've ever felt like you were running from something that was actually pulling you home, I want to know. Tell me in the comments. Were you Team Stellan from the beginning? Or did he have to earn your trust? Because I have a feeling this comment section is about to get very passionate, and I am absolutely here for it. If the fog between us is the kind of story that makes your evenings feel like something, don't leave without subscribing, because there are more worlds like this one waiting, more alphas with impossible restraint, more heroines who don't need saving but choose connection anyway, more fog and fire, and the particular kind of love that costs something real. Hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs a good love story. And if you listened to this all the way through, thank you. Genuinely, you're exactly who this was made for. Until the next story, stay warm, stay in the fog, and never stop choosing.